A flight attendant disrespected a black baby, but the father calmly stepped in and with one quiet move ensured the consequences would hit harder than anyone expected. He kicked a baby's face, thinking no one would dare respond. He didn't know the father had a calm authority that could destroy careers with a single word. Subscribe, if you believe true power doesn't yell, it delivers quietly. The moment Merrick Dalen paused by row 7, the air shifted. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, one hand on the edge of an overhead bin, his eyes fixed not on the father, but on the infant strapped into the narrow seat. His gaze wasn't curious. It wasn't warm. It lingered with something colder, analytical, almost intrusive, like he was sizing up something that shouldn't be there. Darian Cross noticed it immediately. He had just finished fastening the last loop on his son Leo's tiny sneaker, fingers moving with gentle precision. The baby cooed softly, unfazed by the attention, his big brown eyes tracking the flicker of the cabin lights overhead. Darian's back straightened instinctively. His body still crouched, but his senses sharpening like they used to during code audits when something didn't quite add up. He looked up slowly, meeting the flight attendant's stare head-on. "Can I help you?" Darian asked, his voice calm but clear, a quiet wall forming behind his words. Merrick blinked, the illusion of hospitality snapping into place a second too late. "Just making sure your child's secure," he replied, his smile thin and brittle. "He is," Darian said simply, tightening the strap across Leo's chest with an extra tug, though he knew it was already snug. Merrick nodded once, but didn't move. His eyes dropped again to the child, then back to Darian. His jaw flexed, a faint pop beneath the cheekbone. Behind him, several passengers moved along the aisle, jostling their luggage into overhead compartments, their conversations bubbling with the usual travel day tone, annoyed, distracted, impatient. None of them noticed the strange pause by row 7, but someone else did. From 3 rows back, Jaron Holt watched with quiet dread. He had been working with Merrick for nearly 6 months, long enough to know when the man was simmering, long enough to recognize the patterns, the slow, burning silence before something inappropriate slipped out. Or worse. Jaron glanced toward the cockpit, then back at the pair locked in stillness. He took a step forward, stopping when Merrick finally broke away and continued down the aisle. Darian exhaled quietly, brushing a hand over Leo's blanket. The baby giggled, pulling on one of his own socks. For now, the tension passed, like a chill breeze that had moved through and left no trace. But Darian knew better. He had seen that look before, on people who couldn't explain why a child's joy irritated them, on managers who didn't like being reminded of vulnerability, on men who believed silence meant permission. The overhead lights flickered once, briefly, a stutter in the wiring. Or maybe not. Leo pointed upward, babbling his version of surprise, and Darian smiled down at him. "It's okay, little guy," he murmured. "Just lights saying hello." The engines hummed gently beneath the cabin floor, vibrations steady and familiar. Boarding continued. The aisle grew more crowded, but Darian's focus narrowed, not just on Leo, but on the odd tension in the space around them. It was subtle, like a wrong note in an otherwise smooth song. Merrick's footsteps could still be heard, even now, clipped and brisk, walking past seats as though marching toward a private mission. A man across the aisle sneezed. Another passenger asked for assistance lifting a bag. Jaron responded, polite and practiced, but his eyes drifted again to Merrick, who now stood near the galley, rigid, facing forward like a soldier awaiting orders. It was the stillness that gave him away. Not the calm kind, no. The held-back, teeth-grinding stillness of someone who believed they deserved control and didn't have it yet. Darian lifted Leo slightly, adjusting his seat position as the final boarding call echoed through the cabin. Outside, the last rays of afternoon sunlight stretched long across the runway, casting the airplane's shadow in towering silence across the tarmac. The boarding door sealed with a dull metallic thud. For a moment, everything was still. Merrick returned once more, walking past slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't glance directly at row 7 this time, but his eyes flickered, briefly, precisely, toward the child. Jaren clocked it again, tightening his grip on the cart handle beside him. Darian whispered something into Leo's ear. Soft, calming, steady, as the seatbelt sign chimed overhead. He pressed his palm gently over his son's chest, not out of fear, but instinct. His mind traced through protocols, through routes of action, through everything he had learned not just as a father, but as a man who knew what power looked like when it operated behind the mask of policy. Captain Argus Wynn's voice came over the intercom, warm and routine, welcoming passengers and detailing the expected flight duration. But as the aircraft began taxiing down the runway, it wasn't the destination that concerned Darian. It was what had boarded alongside them. From behind, a passenger in row 5 squinted toward the galley and muttered quietly to his seatmate, "That guy in the vest, he doesn't look right today." No one responded. They didn't have to. As the engines roared louder and the cabin lifted off the ground, Darian kept one hand firmly over Leo's seat, the other resting on his own thigh, and in that pocket of sky just above the city, with baby breaths rising steady and soft beside him, he closed his eyes briefly, not in rest, but in preparation. Something had shifted. He could feel it now, and as he opened his eyes and looked up the aisle one more time, he noticed Jaren watching Merrick with the same cautious weight in his stare, and somewhere between that flicker and the first announcement, destiny shifted in silence. The seatbelt sign had barely blinked off when Merrick Dalen began walking down the aisle with slow, almost measured steps. The hum of the aircraft's steady climb filled the cabin, but something beneath that drone felt wrong, off-kilter. As he passed row after row, his eyes darted quickly between passengers, his lips pressed in a tight line, his jaw clicking now and then like he was grinding through some invisible pressure. Near the back galley, Jaren Holt, thinner, younger, and visibly tense, watched him closely. He had already noticed Merrick's frayed patience since boarding, but now the signs were escalating. The clenched fists, the way Merrick snapped at a man who asked for an extra blanket, the tightness in his shoulders that didn't soften even when he smiled. Jaren had whispered once already, near the water cart. "Merrick, take it easy, all right? You know the limits protocols matter. Don't do anything stupid." But Merrick didn't respond. He only turned his head slightly, the corner of his lip curling upward, not in amusement, but in warning. That silent exchange lingered with Jaren as Merrick veered down the aisle again, this time with purpose. Row 7 was just ahead. Darian Cross sat by the window, one arm gently rocking his infant son, Leo, who had just started humming a small, tuneless sound. It was innocent, one of those soft baby noises that meant nothing and everything. Contentment, curiosity, discovery. Darian noticed the steward's slow approach and instinctively pulled Leo a bit closer, not in fear, but in a quiet act of shielding. A passenger in row 5, a middle-aged man with a trim beard and glasses, had also been observing. He leaned slightly toward his seatmate and murmured under his breath, "That guy shouldn't be working today." But his words were swallowed by the engines and the indifference of strangers mid-flight. Merrick reached row 7 and stopped. His shadow fell across Leo's legs, and the baby paused his humming, blinking up at the man with innocent curiosity. Leo giggled once, reaching a small hand toward the buttons on Merrick's vest. "Your baby needs to stay silent," Merrick said suddenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a cold, clipped sharpness to it, like steel barely sheathed. Darian turned his head slowly, making deliberate eye contact. "Excuse me?" "It's disturbing the passengers," Merrick clarified, motioning toward the cabin. Darian looked around. No one seemed disturbed. No heads were turning. If anything, most passengers were asleep or minding their own business. His tone remained calm. "He's not crying," Just humming. Still, Merrick said. Keep him quiet. Discipline him. Darian blinked slowly, the words settling like smoke in his chest. He's not even a year old. Merrick leaned closer. Too close. The air between them tightened. Do something, Merrick said, the corners of his mouth twitching with the control he was struggling to maintain, before it gets out of hand. Jaren had crept forward by now, lingering a few rows behind, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes darted between Darian and Merrick, and though he didn't speak, the way he furrowed his brow and shifted his weight forward suggested he was bracing for something. Then Merrick made a small, dismissive sound in his throat and muttered under his breath, "Unruly infants. Too many of them lately." The phrase didn't feel like idle talk. It felt rehearsed, like it belonged to some deeper frustration, one that had little to do with the child in front of him. Leo made another soft, cooing sound. Unaware, Merrick's gaze sharpened. Without warning, he jabbed a finger toward the child's feet, not touching, but close enough to make Darian's entire posture change. He placed his hand swiftly, firmly between Leo and Merrick's hand, blocking the space without a word. The message was unmistakable. Merrick didn't back away. You people think rules don't apply when it's a baby. They do, especially when the rest of us have a job to do. Step back, Darian said softly. His voice was even, but there was steel underneath. Now. A man across the aisle discreetly slid his phone from airplane mode, angling the camera forward. He didn't raise it high. He didn't announce it. He simply pressed record. From the rear, Jaren took half a step forward but stopped. Unsure whether his presence would inflame or de-escalate, Merrick didn't move. Instead, he muttered something about cabin duty tolerance limits, and the phrase seemed to hang there like a threat written in regulation speak. Jaren stiffened. That phrase wasn't casual. It was policy jargon, and hearing it come from Merrick's mouth meant only one thing. He was preparing to justify whatever came next. Darian, for all his restraint, felt something begin to churn inside him. The memory of oxygen monitors. Sleepless nights beside a NICU crib. The smallest cough from Leo had once meant rushing to the hospital, and now this man, this stranger, stood before him, radiating hostility toward his son for making a joyful sound. And still, he did not react. Not physically. He didn't stand, didn't raise his voice. He simply shifted his body to fully block Leo from Merrick's view. A barrier of silence and resolve. Merrick stared at him for a moment longer, chest rising and falling faster than before. There was a trembling in his jaw now, a tremor of withheld impulse. No one else saw it clearly but Jaren, and the man recording quietly across the aisle. Then Merrick stepped forward, just slightly, just enough to make Darian's shoulders tense, just enough to make Leo let out a surprised squeak, and with each step he took toward them, the line between routine and danger thinned. "Your baby needs to stay silent. It's disturbing passengers." The words dropped like stones in the narrow aisle, sudden and uncalled for. Darian looked up slowly, his hand still resting protectively on the side of Leo's carrier seat. The baby, barely 11 months old, wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was humming softly, a light, airy melody only a father could decipher, part comfort, part curiosity, the kind of sound that meant safety. Darian met Merrick Dalen's eyes without blinking. "He's not crying," he said gently, with a calm that felt deliberate. "Just humming. He's fine." Merrick stood stiffly, hands behind his back like a soldier holding tension by force. His jaw worked side to side as if chewing on the words he wanted to throw next. His voice came colder this time, lips barely parting. "You need to discipline the child before things get out of hand." Darian's eyebrows lifted just slightly. He adjusted the blanket on Leo's lap without responding right away, but something behind his eyes shifted. He had traveled enough, worked in enough boardrooms, reviewed enough hostile response reports to recognize the edge in Merrick's tone. This wasn't a flight attendant having a hard day. This was personal. From behind, Jaron Holt approached quietly, hovering just close enough to observe, but not intervene. His face twitched, eyes darting from Merrick to Darian. Then he gave the barest of nods. It wasn't permission. It was warning. Something's not right. Merrick leaned in a fraction closer. The space between his body and the baby's seat narrowed dangerously. Darian's shoulders tensed. Leo, sensing the shift, went quiet. "You're violating cabin duty tolerance," Merrick hissed, almost to himself. A man, 2 rows up, blinked, slowly unbuckling airplane mode from his phone. He turned the screen on and angled it down discreetly. Camera app open. The atmosphere shifted. An invisible current of anticipation filled the aisle, though no one dared speak. Then Merrick moved. Not fully. Not obviously, just enough. He jabbed a finger sharply toward Leo's dangling feet, like someone trying to prod an insect off a surface. Darian's hand shot out, catching Merrick's wrist before the finger made contact. It wasn't forceful, but it was definitive. Protective. His palm remained there, pressed between the stranger and his son, a quiet boundary drawn not in anger, but resolve. "Do not touch my child," Darian said softly. The sound in the cabin dulled, like the air had thickened. Even the overhead fan hum seemed quieter. Merrick didn't step back. He didn't apologize. He stared down at Darian, breathing a little harder now, as if wrestling with a decision. His eyes danced, not with guilt, but something reckless, something unhinged. "You don't get special treatment just because you have a baby," he muttered under his breath. "We're not your babysitters." Jaron visibly flinched at that. His lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. He stood there frozen, trapped between policy and conscience, watching a fellow crew member spiral in real time. "You've made your point," Darian replied, his voice steel wrapped in velvet. "Now, step away." But Merrick didn't. His shadow lingered over Leo's small face, casting a gray veil across the child's innocent features. Leo looked up with wide eyes, his small lips curling into a confused, Not quite a whimper, but close. Merrick's hands twitched. Darian didn't move. Jaron took half a step forward, then stopped. And in that breathless moment, every passenger felt the invisible line Merrick was about to cross. Merrick's foot snapped forward. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't confused. It was sharp, calculated, an act so precise that no one could mistake it for anything but intentional. His polished shoe cut through the narrow space between him and the baby, aiming directly for Leo's face. The motion carved through the tension that had been building, quiet and invisible, but now shattered like glass underfoot. Darian saw it all. Reflex was faster than thought. His left arm jerked instinctively, shielding Leo just in time. The padded arc of Merrick's shoe met the meat of Darian's forearm instead of his son's cheek. The redirected force caused Leo's head to bob slightly in the cushioned seat, a small wince crossing the child's soft features. But the damage had been averted. No mark, no bruise. Not this time. Gasps erupted behind them. Raw, human reactions that snapped the surrounding passengers into the present like an alarm bell. A woman 2 rows back slapped her hand to her mouth. Someone in 6C whispered, "Did he just?" but couldn't finish the sentence. A phone beeped back to life as a man across the aisle switched off airplane mode and hit record without hesitation. Another man's tray table clattered closed, the sound swallowed by a silence that had grown electric. Merrick stood still, his chest rising and falling in angry, uneven pulls. His posture betrayed no regret, only the release of some internal storm that had now breached the surface. His eyes didn't even look at Leo. They were locked on Darian, wild and unrepentant, like a man who expected applause for delivering order. Darian rose, not in haste, not in rage. He moved like the slow rise of water in a glass, measured, inevitable, controlled. Leo whimpered faintly, sensing something wrong, and Darian cradled him with one arm, brushing a hand through the boy's hair to soothe the tremble rising from his small chest. He kissed the child's forehead once, his lips brushing warm skin. Then, without saying a word, he set Leo gently into the seat beside him, adjusted the blanket so it covered his legs, and tucked a corner under his chin. The cabin fell still. Even the air vents seemed to hush. A few passengers leaned forward, breaths held, afraid to speak, afraid to shift, afraid that even the sound of movement might shatter the moment unfolding before them. Behind Merrick, Jaron Holt stood frozen near the beverage cart, his eyes wide, his jaw tight, as if some internal alarm had finally gone off. Too late, but undeniable, Darian turned to face Merrick fully. He stood with one foot braced near Leo's seat, the other planted squarely in the aisle, posture tall, spine straight. His hands were loose by his sides, empty, unthreatening, but his eyes told a different story. They weren't angry, they weren't afraid. They were clear, too clear. Merrick tried to speak, his lips twitching with a half-started defense, but Darian cut him off without volume, without force. Just a voice carried through stillness like a thread through fabric. You just lost your pension. For a long, stretching second after Darian uttered the words, you just lost your pension, time fractured. The hum of the engine softened behind the weight of collective shock. Rows of passengers, once half engaged with books, earbuds, or idle conversation, now leaned forward as if gravity itself had changed direction. In row 7, no one moved. No one spoke. Merrick Dalen's face blazed red with disbelief, veins rising at his temples, his mouth twitching open, then snapping shut, as if searching for a script that had been stolen mid-rehearsal. Leo whimpered softly. The delayed tremor of fear traveled through his small frame like a wave after an earthquake. His eyes blinked rapidly, confusion drawing a crease between his brows. Darian instantly turned away from Merrick, his protective instincts overriding the tension in the cabin. He scooped Leo into his arms with practiced gentleness, whispering soothing rhythms near his ear, one hand resting lightly on his son's back while the other pressed calmly against the armrest for grounding. His breathing stayed even. He didn't flinch, didn't escalate, didn't posture, but his silence thundered louder than any shouting could have. Merrick took half a step forward, almost as if propelled by adrenaline or the echo of past authority. But before he could speak, Jaron Holt, still pale, still sweating, moved in. His voice was low but firm, enough to command attention without sparking panic. "Merrick, step back. Cabin conduct provisions," he said, invoking the very regulation Merrick had once weaponized against passengers on lesser grounds. His words hung in the air like a verdict carved into the fuselage. Across the aisle, a man rose slightly from his seat. Raylan Doran, mid-30s, business casual, sharp eyes that hadn't missed a second, held his phone upright in one hand, the screen still glowing. "I've got everything," he said clearly, voice cutting through the murmur like a bell, "and I'm willing to testify." A quiet gasp swept the nearby rows like wind through tall grass. That sentence, so plainly spoken, acted like a key in a lock one by one. Other voices followed, hesitant at first, but growing louder, firmer. That was a kick. He hit the baby. I saw it. It wasn't a stumble. Courage, fragile and contagious, bloomed from seat to seat. Passengers who had once sunk into their cushions now found their voices. Eyes sharpened. Phones rose. Truth multiplied. Merrick turned in place, blinking at the crowd as though stunned that the tide had turned so swiftly. "It was an accident," he stammered, lifting his hands, palms outward. I stumbled. It wasn't." Raylan didn't even blink. "Then why does the video show a clean strike?" He played the footage aloud. No commentary. Just the moment, undeniable. Merrick's foot rising and driving forward with deliberate aim toward the side of Leo's head. The angle, the force, the precision. There was no flailing, no trip, just intent. Merrick's lips trembled. He turned to Jaren, then back to the passengers, but every gaze was now a mirror reflecting judgment he couldn't escape. His authority had collapsed, and in its place stood something colder, public accountability. Darian stood, slowly and deliberately. He didn't tower, he didn't threaten. He adjusted the blanket around Leo's legs, tucking the corners with care, then looked up, meeting the eyes of those around him. "If you recorded anything," he said softly, his voice calm and level, "please don't delete it. Keep it safe. If investigators ask, be willing to share what you saw." There was no plea in his tone, no anger, just quiet leadership. It worked better than any command. People nodded instinctively. Even those who had not filmed the event whispered to their neighbors to ensure evidence would be preserved. Jaren shifted forward again, now fully between Merrick and the father he'd threatened. His stance wasn't aggressive, it was protective, solid, a living wall in a narrow aisle. He said nothing more, but his posture spoke volumes. The man who had once deferred to Merrick now stood between him and any further harm. The air inside the cabin had changed. What was once just recycled oxygen and artificial calm now felt like the charged silence before a judge reads a sentence. Overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting sterile illumination over passengers who no longer saw a flight. They saw a reckoning. Merrick took a half-step back. He glanced toward the front of the plane, toward the cockpit, toward escape. But it was too late. He had walked too far down a road that no longer had exits. Darian gently placed Leo back into the seat, his hand steady as he adjusted the baby's blanket again. He didn't look away from Merrick, not even once, as he folded the fabric with care. And in that narrow space above the clouds, the man who stayed calm became the one everyone silently trusted. Merrick's hand shot toward the cabin phone like a reflex, his voice sharp and controlled as he pressed the receiver against his ear and muttered low enough for only the nearest passengers to hear. "Security on landing. Row 7. Male passenger. Possible threat." The words came out mechanical, rehearsed, like someone who had prepared for this exact script, not for truth, but for control. Darian watched him with silent intensity, Leo still resting against his chest. He could feel the subtle shift in the air, the tightening of breaths, the pause in conversation 2 rows over, the quiet camera phone lens peeking from behind a paperback in row 6A storm had started, and Merrick was trying to steer it in his favor. But Darian had weathered other storms. Without hesitation, he stood, not fully, just enough so that his upper body rose above the seats, his face calm, visible. He adjusted Leo gently into the crook of his arm and turned his focus not to Merrick, but to Jaren Holt. "I need to speak with the captain," Darian said, his voice composed but commanding. "Directly. Now." Jaren hesitated. The weight of the moment showed in his posture, shoulders drawn, eyes darting between Merrick's glare and Darian's unwavering expression. Rules were rules. But conscience didn't always follow protocol. With a slow exhale, Jaren reached forward and handed Darian the cabin phone. "Line to the cockpit is active," he murmured. "You'll have 30 seconds before priority override kicks in." Darian nodded once, grateful but unshaken. He turned slightly away from the aisle and spoke into the receiver with the same precision he used in conference rooms filled with executives. "Captain Wynne, this is Darian Cross in row 7. I'm requesting that a formal cabin incident report be initiated immediately. A flight attendant, Merrick Dalen, intentionally kicked my 11-month-old son in the face. Multiple passengers witnessed it. Several are recording. I have not responded physically or verbally outside normal protest. I have remained seated and non-confrontational. The child is safe, but shaken." Silence on the line. Then, "Understood," came a firm male voice from the other end. "Name again?" "Darian Cross." There was a pause, a subtle shift in the tone, recognition sharpening the edge of Captain Argus Wynne's next words. "I'm aware of your role, Mr. Cross. Your name has crossed my desk. Stand by." In the cockpit, Argus leaned forward, rifling through his memory. He had read Darian's name in one of the compliance risk briefs distributed months ago, something about integrity audits, employee conduct tracking, systems-level liability assessments. The man now requesting action wasn't a random passenger. He was someone with weight. Back in the cabin, Darian waited. Leo stirred in his arms, but did not cry. The boy's tiny hand curled against his father's shirt as if drawing strength from the heartbeat beneath it. The captain's voice returned, now carefully measured. "Mr. Cross, the incident will be logged in our flight report. I'm instructing all cabin crew to ensure that no footage is deleted or witnesses interfered with. You will remain seated for your safety and that of your child. Ground personnel will handle this immediately upon landing. Do you understand?" "I do," Darian replied, "and thank you for taking this seriously." As he ended the call and passed the phone back to Jaren, there was no triumph in his face, just focus. Jaren accepted the phone with hands that trembled slightly. "That took more courage than protocol ever teaches," Darian said softly, offering Jaren a look that acknowledged the risk he had just taken. Jaren gave a shallow nod, barely able to meet Darian's gaze. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "I didn't know what he'd do. I didn't expect that." "No one ever does," Darian replied, gently readjusting the blanket around Leo's chest. "But knowing when to act, that matters more than being ready." Behind them, Merrick stood frozen near the galley door, half-turned, his complexion pale and growing paler. He had overheard enough. He knew what it meant when the captain used phrases like incident report and witness interference. He understood what it meant when his actions were no longer contained within the cabin walls but logged into official records, bound for administrators, auditors, and eventually lawyers. Still, he clung to the illusion of control. "It was a misunderstanding," Merrick barked suddenly, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked halfway. "I stumbled. I already said I stumbled." "Then why are there 4 videos playing from 3 different rows?" Raylan Doran called out flatly from across the aisle, holding up his screen. A few heads turned. Someone else whispered, "I've got the same footage," and the hum of quiet resistance swelled. Merrick's mouth opened to retort, but nothing came. Just air. Just desperation. Passengers weren't afraid anymore. The shift had happened too subtly for Merrick to catch. It wasn't just Darian's calm, it was the ripple of composed defiance, the realization that the real authority in the cabin wasn't the man wearing the uniform, but the man protecting his child without rage or spectacle. Jaren stepped back to his position near the galley but subtly positioned himself closer to Darian than Merrick, as if drawing a line in the narrow aisle with nothing but presence. Leo gave a soft, sleepy sigh against his father's chest. Darian looked down and smiled faintly, brushing a hand across the baby's back. He didn't say another word to Merrick. He didn't need to. And while the engines hummed steadily forward, Merrick finally understood that his real turbulence had only just begun. With Leo's warm breath rising and falling steadily against his chest, Darian began to move, not with haste, but with the purposeful calm of a man who had built his life around precision. The overhead lights flickered once more above row 7, but no one noticed this time. Their eyes were fixed on Merrick, who stood rattled in the galley, muttering to himself, hands trembling as he clutched the cabin tablet. Meanwhile, Darian gently adjusted his son's position and leaned forward, locking eyes with the man across the aisle. "You filmed it?" Darian asked in a voice just above a whisper. Raylan Doran, still holding his phone with the screen dimmed but recording, gave a tight nod. "Got everything." "Please don't delete it. In fact," Darian's voice remained low, unthreatening, but firm. "Send a copy to this address." He spoke a string of letters and numbers, an internal compliance submission channel, so smoothly it didn't sound memorized but embedded. Raylan raised an eyebrow. "That's not a personal email." "No," Darian replied. It's the reporting gateway for Aranex Holdings' Ethics and Risk Audit Division. I helped write the retention protocol." Raylan blinked. A few rows down, a man who'd silently recorded the scene from the left aisle perked up and leaned forward to hear the address again. Darian repeated it clearly, his eyes never leaving Merrick, who now seemed to realize something was unraveling, and not in his favor. Behind the curtain of the galley, Merrick's fingers flew across the service terminal. His screen showed a partially completed service log with a dangerously falsified entry. Row 7. Passenger exhibiting threatening posture, verbal aggression. His chest heaved as he tapped the final sentence. Child behavior causing passenger distress. Each word was a calculated lie, meant to paint Darian as the aggressor and himself as the misunderstood professional. He thought it was working. But Jaron Holt stood behind him, quiet as breath. The younger flight attendant had slipped in unnoticed, having seen enough to make up his mind. His eyes narrowed as he watched Merrick manipulate the log entry. Timestamp ticking in the top corner with every keystroke. Jaron's training kicked in. Altering a service record post-incident was grounds for review, even termination. He didn't speak. He simply pulled out his own access device and navigated discreetly through the back end, exporting the original untouched log to his secure cloud profile. He named the file Row 7 Original Entry and encrypted it with a passcode known only to him. Merrick didn't notice. Back at Row 7, Darian pulled a napkin from the seat back pocket and began writing. Bullet-pointed, chronological, exact. He logged each phrase Merrick had used. Discipline the child. Tolerance limit, out of hand. He wasn't writing for drama. He was building a time-stamped record. Each line etched in tidy script, his pen moving in rhythm with the engines outside. Leo stirred lightly in his sleep, sighing through his nose, and curling closer, Darian steadied his hand on the child's back, never letting his own pulse rise. He'd lived through audits more brutal than this, internal inquiries where lies dressed as reports and truth had to be reverse-engineered from silence. He knew how this game worked. "Hey," a man across the row said gently, "do you want my video too? I only caught the last half, but—" "Yes," Darian nodded without hesitation. "Keep it safe for now. I may ask for it." The quiet spread again, not as silence, but as strategy. 3 more passengers exchanged glances. One raised his phone. Another mouthed the compliance address, repeating it under his breath like a prayer. Jaron returned to the cabin, nodding once as he passed Darian, their eyes meeting briefly. There was something unspoken in that glance, an understanding forged not through trust, but necessity. Merrick, now pale and fidgeting, peeked past the galley curtain and saw the quiet murmurs, the phones, the notes, the looks, and, for the first time, he realized he was no longer ahead of the story. When the captain's voice crackled overhead, it cut through the cabin like a gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Rendell City shortly. Please remain seated. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The tone was calm, but beneath it lived a warning. A message encoded not for passengers, but for Merrick, who had, without realizing it, handed Darian a direct line to the cockpit. Back in Row 7, Darian folded the napkin neatly and tucked it into the pocket beside Leo's blanket. He didn't need to read it again. He had memorized every word, every moment, every look. The case had already begun, and while the cabin descended, the truth was rising. And as the city lights rose to meet them through the clouds, Darian had already turned a moment of cruelty into the foundation of a case. He laughed, convinced the act would go unpunished, unaware every eye in the cabin was now fixed on the father's steady hands and icy calm. If you believe arrogance always meets consequences when facing dignity, hit subscribe now, because justice never needs to raise its voice. The landing gear struck the tarmac with a hollow, deliberate thud. Inside the cabin, the usual relief that accompanied touchdown was absent. No claps, no murmurs of, "We're here," just the low hum of engines winding down and a suffocating silence. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, not rushed, not routine, but with the weight of something that couldn't be softened. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated after parking ground personnel will board shortly to address a serious onboard incident." The air shifted. Whispers sprang like sparks across rows. A mother in seat 11C clutched her toddler a little tighter. In row 5, a man slowly reached up to turn off his overhead light, not for comfort, but because the illumination made him feel too visible. Every eye in the cabin drifted, almost unwillingly, toward Merrick Dalen. He stood near the galley, arms stiff at his sides, his composure fraying beneath the scrutiny. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform. His lips moved silently for a second, rehearsing something, some story, some defense. The door opened. 2 men in dark navy jackets stepped in, badges clipped high, eyes scanning like spotlights. Supervisor Lorne Vess walked with the self-assured rhythm of someone used to rewriting endings behind him. Investigator Reynold Carr carried a leather-bound tablet under one arm, his expression unreadable. Merrick moved first. "There he is," he barked, pointing directly at Darian Cross. "He lunged at me. He got aggressive over a disruptive child." Darian didn't move. He remained seated, Leo resting against his chest, one hand gently rocking the child, the other still on the armrest. Raylan Doran rose from his seat like someone called by name. "That's not what happened," he said evenly. He held up his phone. "I recorded everything." Taryn Wells, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard 2 rows back, stood as well. "I have the same thing from another angle. You're welcome to view it now." Lorne's confident expression trembled. He raised a hand in mock calm. "Let's take this off the aircraft," he suggested. "We can review all concerns privately. No need for alarm." Darian's voice cut through the aisle, low, measured, not a decibel above necessary. "I respectfully request that all witnesses be allowed to disembark nearby. Not dismissed, not separated. Statements should be voluntary and transparent." A pause. It was the tone, not just the words, that landed. The tone of someone who had said things like this before and always meant them. Lorne blinked just once, but the trapdoor was already visible now. Jaron Holt stepped forward, his voice shakier than Darian's but steady enough. "Merrick altered the service log mid-flight. I saved a backup copy. Time-stamped." Reynold Carr turned his head slowly toward Merrick, one eyebrow twitching. His silence said more than any outburst could. He tapped the screen of his tablet and began a quiet series of notes. Lorne opened his mouth, then closed it again. The old tactics weren't landing here. Raylan's phone remained in the air. He pressed play. The kick played on screen in harsh truth. Gasps echoed again, softer now, coated in disbelief and moral nausea. Merrick tried to speak, but nothing came. His mouth moved, no sound. "We can discuss interpretations later," Lorne offered quickly. "But let's not allow emotions to distort." Jaron shook his head. "It's on camera. The child didn't provoke anything. Darian didn't lunge. There's no distortion." "I agree," said Taryn. "This isn't emotion. This is fact." Merrick took a half step toward the group. "It was just a stumble," he offered, his voice a brittle whisper. "A misstep. Not—" "No one stumbles like that," said Raylan flatly. The aisle narrowed with the weight of tension. No one shouted. No one stormed. But power shifted, molecule by molecule, from the uniformed to the witnesses. Reynold didn't move except to lift his tablet and quietly document names as Darian recited them. "These individuals have footage, and they're willing to give statements. I'd like all of them within proximity. No dispersal." Lorne tried again. "We have protocols. These need to be logged centrally before media." "We're past that," Reynolds said without looking up. "If this footage gets deleted or delayed, that becomes obstruction, and we're not layering this." Jaron's breath caught. He hadn't expected Reynolds to say that neither had Merrick. Behind them, the lights outside the aircraft flickered to life as the mobile stair unit connected. The click of the latch echoed like a sentence being handed down. And still, Darian didn't move. He just tightened his arms around Leo, who stirred slightly, then settled again with a soft sound. Lorne made one final attempt. "We'll conduct a proper debrief. In the incident room. We just want accurate accounts." Darian nodded slowly. "Good, because we all came ready to tell the truth." For a moment, all anyone could hear was the distant whir of luggage carts on the tarmac. The aircraft's shell felt less like a vessel and more like a courtroom, its rows now filled with quiet resolve instead of assumption. Reynolds turned toward the exit and motioned calmly, "Let's proceed." And as the cabin doors finally opened, it was not freedom that stepped in first, but accountability. They led the group into a stark, windowless incident room just beyond the terminal's side corridor. No frills, no view, just surveillance cameras nestled into each corner and a long aluminum table that divided the space like a courtroom bench. The air inside was cool, clinical, and carried the faint static buzz of ceiling vents. The silence was broken only by the soft shuffle of shoes as passengers filed in, still reeling from the gravity of what they'd witnessed. Supervisor Lorne Vess gestured toward the chairs like a judge instructing a jury, though his expression betrayed urgency more than authority. "We'll begin shortly. I ask for your patience. We'll speak with parties involved individually," he announced, his tone practiced but brittle. He expected order. What he received was resistance. Raylan Doran and Taryn Wells, two passengers who had both recorded the incident, sat flanking Darian Cross as if forming a protective line. Neither moved toward the back of the room when Lorne motioned for witnesses to wait. Their expressions were resolute, quiet, but clear. They were not stepping aside. Across the room, Merrick Dalen wiped his palms against his slacks, his shirt clinging slightly with sweat. He looked everywhere but at the child he had struck. His voice cracked as he began again, a routine he'd now repeated too many times. "I tripped. My leg caught on the aisle lip." "That's not what the video shows," Raylan said sharply without looking up, just loud enough to cut through the middle of the room. His phone rested on the table before him like a sword still sheathed, but ready. Merrick glanced at Lorne, who nodded slightly, giving him silent permission to continue his defense. "I never meant to. Look, it was just contact. Brief. Unfortunate." Reynold Carr, the internal investigator, sat opposite Darian, scribbling a note without making eye contact. His pen paused mid-stroke. Then, as if changing course entirely, he raised his eyes and said evenly, "Mr. Cross, on the flight, you said something specifically. You just lost your pension. Can I ask why you chose those words?" The room quieted again, like someone had shut off the electricity. Even the air vents seemed to hush. Darian adjusted Leo gently in his arms. The child had finally fallen into a light sleep, breath warm against his father's chest. Darian didn't speak right away. He inhaled once as if weighing how much truth the room could handle, then exhaled slowly. "When I said that," he began, voice calm, "it wasn't a threat. It was an observation, a professional one." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "My work with Aranex Holdings," Darian continued, "isn't just limited to safety audits. I conduct ethical risk assessments. I evaluate how exposed the company is to legal claims, PR fallout, and financial liability, especially concerning employee conduct." He looked at Merrick, then at Lorne, before landing his gaze squarely on Reynolds. "Verilyn has been on our internal watch list for nearly 18 months. Due to inconsistent incident reporting, I personally flagged multiple irregularities, crew misconduct cases that were either downplayed or erased from logs. Several of them had Supervisor Vess's name attached as the final reviewer." Lorne stiffened. A small tremor twitched at the corner of his lip, though he tried to mask it by folding his arms tightly. "So, when I saw what happened today, what Merrick did, and how quickly an attempt was made to redirect the narrative, Darian said, motioning subtly toward Merrick's now silent protests. I understood what this incident would become once reviewed. Not just a PR issue. Not just a flight-level infraction. A documented harm-to-minor case involving a previously flagged employee whose actions were enabled by negligent oversight. The twist landed with all the weight of a closing gavel. For a moment, no one breathed. Taryn leaned back slowly, arms crossed now in visible support. Raylan stared forward, mouth half open in disbelief. Even Reynolds leaned back in his chair, the pen in his hand momentarily forgotten. Darian's voice softened as he added, "So when I said, 'You just lost your pension,' I wasn't angry. I wasn't threatening him. I was simply stating what happens when the system finally catches up to the people who thought they'd never face it." Merrick's face had drained to a colorless gray. His jaw clenched, but no words followed. He suddenly looked smaller, no longer the authority figure walking down the aisle, but a man realizing his name was about to become a cautionary tale in a training slideshow. Lorne tried to reassert control, clearing his throat. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said stiffly. "We haven't completed the fact-finding portion." But the illusion of control had already evaporated. The passengers weren't afraid of him anymore. Even Reynolds' body language had shifted, from compliance to calculation, as if he were reassessing who exactly was worth defending in this room. Darian's eyes moved between Merrick, Lorne, and Reynolds slowly, methodically, before dropping once more to his sleeping son. The room remained quiet, and in that still room above the baggage halls, everyone finally understood that those 7 quiet words had been a verdict, not a warning. "Submit the event as a minor service dispute." Lorne Vess's voice echoed in the incident room, polished and rehearsed like a man used to winning with words. He folded his hands on the sleek metal table, a hollow smile playing on his lips as he offered travel vouchers to the passengers involved. The air in the room thickened, not from heat, but from the stench of desperation leaking through Lorne's corporate mask. He was trying to drag the narrative back under control, but everyone could feel it. The grip was slipping. Raylan Doran didn't hesitate. He sat upright, spine stiff, eyes locked on Lorne. "If you even soften the truth by 1 inch," he said clearly, "I'll send my video directly to federal transport regulators. It's already backed up to 3 locations." Lorne blinked, caught off guard by the speed and precision of the response. Across the table, Taryn Wells tapped his phone, raising it briefly. "Same here. Angle from the left side. Synced it to the cloud while we were still taxiing. You can't make this disappear." Darian Cross remained silent for now, gently rocking Leo in his arms, the baby finally asleep again. His focus wasn't on Lorne, but on timing. He knew this wasn't just a confrontation, it was the beginning of a hearing. One without a judge's robe, but with judgment nonetheless. Jaron Holt stood next. Trembling slightly, he adjusted his tie but didn't waver. "I saw the kick," he began, voice rough but honest. "I saw the way Merrick pressed Darian, and I saw him try to change the service log in the galley. I should have stopped him sooner." Lorne turned his gaze to Jaron sharply. "Jaron, let's not be hasty." "I exported the log," Jaron interrupted, surprising even himself. "The unedited one. The original entry shows no misconduct from Darian until Merrick changed it. I have it saved on an external device. It's time-stamped. That can't be rewritten." A long, strained silence fell. For a moment, the room felt like it had shrunk. The sleek walls, the surveillance cameras in the corners. Suddenly, they weren't props of order but silent witnesses themselves, cold and impartial. Reynold Carr, the investigator who had been watching carefully, took a breath. His posture shifted, no longer passive. "Has the child been examined by medical staff yet?" he asked calmly, turning his head slightly toward Darian. It was a strategic pivot, subtle, meant to question the credibility of the father by implying emotional exaggeration. Darian raised his eyes without moving his body. A full pediatric evaluation is scheduled. He's stable, but shaken. His voice remained even. What I said on the plane, Mr. Carr, about Merrick's pension. That wasn't heat-of-the-moment anger. It was a professional projection. Reynolds furrowed his brow. What do you mean by projection? Darian adjusted Leo's blanket with one hand, his tone never rising. My role with Aranex Holdings includes systemic ethics reviews and exposure modeling for long-term liability risk. Pensions are protected until they're not. When patterns of misconduct escalate to a certain threshold linked to harm, especially involving minors, the system calculates the loss. Lorne flinched just slightly, but it was visible. Darian continued. I've reviewed Verilyn before. Flagged trends. The misclassification of incident reports warnings were ignored. He looked around the table. Not confrontational, just certain. So when I said those words, it wasn't a threat. It was the likely outcome once this reached the board. Raylan let out a quiet breath, half a chuckle of disbelief. You were the one auditing them? He muttered, shaking his head. No wonder he panicked. Taryn leaned in, voice lower now. This is way beyond a voucher. Reynolds' hand subtly moved to the tablet on the table, checking a record. There it was. Darian Cross, listed as a senior external ethics officer on Aranex Holdings compliance interface. It wasn't just that he had power. It was that he knew exactly how it would be used, when, and where. Lorne's forehead shone with fresh sweat. He tried again, but this time his voice faltered. Mr. Cross, perhaps we can agree this was all avoidable. Yes, Darian replied softly. It could have been avoided, but not in this room. It needed to be avoided in the aisles, with restraint, with accountability. All eyes turned to the cameras mounted near the ceiling. For the first time, Lorne seemed to remember they were on, not to protect him, but to witness him. The silence that followed was not empty. It brimmed with clarity, the kind that comes only when all illusions fall away. Merrick hadn't just kicked a child. Lorne hadn't just ignored a complaint. And this wasn't just an inquiry. It was the start of something neither of them could walk away from unscathed. And in that moment, Lorne understood that the story was no longer his to shape, only his to answer for. The moment Reynolds stepped out of the room, the air thickened. His vague excuse, consult with upper administration, hung like a false exit sign over a room already simmering with consequence. Darian didn't look up. He sat in a corner chair beside a small table, rocking Leo gently in his arms. The child had grown quiet, lulled by his father's steady rhythm, oblivious to the legal machinery slowly grinding to life around them. But Darian's mind was far from still. He reviewed each detail from the flight, mentally aligning witness statements with his napkin notes. His fingers tightened slightly around the folded square in his pocket, inked with every phrase Merrick had uttered. Every movement, every response, each word mattered now. Jaren approached with quiet steps, his face pale but resolved. He held a small data stick in his hand and extended it without a word. Darian looked at him, eyes calm but searching. It's the unaltered service log, Jaren finally said, his voice hushed. Before he started changing it, I saved a backup. I should have done more, but... You did what mattered, Darian interrupted, taking the stick and tucking it beside his notes. Courage shows up late sometimes. What matters is that it shows up. Jaren exhaled, his shoulders sagging as though permission to forgive himself had just been granted. He nodded once, then stepped back to the perimeter of the room, where passengers sat scattered, some speaking softly, others just watching the door. Reynolds had vanished through. Time passed slowly, minutes bending like hours beneath the weight of unspoken verdicts. When the door finally opened again, Reynolds' expression had changed. The practiced neutrality was cracking. He carried a small tablet pressed flat against his side like a shield. Crossing the room, He didn't bother retaking the head chair. Instead, he stood behind it, fingers curled around the top rail like a man bracing for impact. "I've received confirmation," he began, eyes flicking briefly to Darien before scanning the room. "An automated escalation flag was triggered by timestamp discrepancies in our log system. The Aerovance Review Board has been notified." Gasps flickered through the passengers. A few men exchanged quick glances. Merrick sat still, blinking. Then the color began to drain from his face as comprehension caught up to him. Reynolds continued, his voice tight. "Mr. Merrick Dalen, effective immediately, you are placed on provisional suspension pending formal review by the Ethics Tribunal." Merrick's knees buckled. The word suspension didn't land softly. It carved straight through him. He collapsed into a nearby chair without grace or resistance, his jaw slack, eyes staring through the carpet like it had answers. Darien didn't move. His gaze held steady on the back wall, his arms wrapped securely around Leo. But his mind sharpened. The system had finally stirred Lorne Vess, who had been unusually quiet, now surged forward. "With respect, that's premature," he said sharply, rising to his feet. "We haven't finished internal." Reynolds raised a single hand, silencing him. "Leadership decisions will also be reviewed, especially those that enabled prior violations to go unaddressed." His tone was flat, but the implication landed like a gavel. Lorne flinched, mouth opening slightly before closing again. He looked at Darien, then at Jaren, then at Merrick, each one a living fragment of the structure he had tried to control. His carefully curated version of the truth had crumbled, and the cameras in the corners of the room, the ones he'd once used to intimidate, now watched him. Instead, Darien finally turned his head, his gaze meeting Reynolds for the briefest second. He said nothing. There was no need. Every word that mattered had already been spoken. Jaren sat down, almost shaking, the weight of the day folding into his posture. The other passengers leaned back in their chairs, a hush settling over them as realization rippled outward. For Merrick, the silence was no longer a shield. It was a sentence. He stared at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else, the edges of his career fraying faster than he could mend. Darien looked down at his son. Leo stirred, nestling closer. The moment was quiet, but it carried weight. A whisper of change moving through polished floors and institutional walls. The room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer, but something important had shifted. Not just policy, not just perception. Power. The kind of power that comes not from volume, but from truth that refuses to be erased. And in that exhausted room, the truth finally moved from whispered recordings to official consequence. The footage spread faster than policy could catch up within 24 hours of landing. Video clips from passengers aboard Verilyn Air Flight 327 had found their way into encrypted internal portals, private inboxes of senior executives, and eventually, uncomfortably, into the Aeronex Holdings Ethics Committee's secure review queue. The first video, sent by Raylan Doran, showed the moment Merrick Dalen's foot lashed out toward baby Leo's cheek. The next clip came from Taryn Wells, capturing the confrontation that followed. By the third video submission, the pattern was undeniable. This hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been a deliberate act of aggression by a uniformed crew member against a defenseless child. The internal firestorm ignited quickly. Ethics Officer Jorlin Venn convened a rapid response tribunal with a single instruction. Pull every log, manifest, and crew report connected to Flight 327. Within hours, Jaren Holtz saved backup of the tampered service log surfaced, verifying Merrick's attempt to rewrite history midair. When Darien's name appeared in the official incident report, as both witness and affected party, it was immediately cross-referenced with existing compliance records. That's when the second wave of shock hit. Darien Cross wasn't just a systems architect. He was an ethics and risk compliance auditor who had submitted a flagged report 6 months prior. warning Aranex Holdings about patterns of misconduct on Verilyn-operated flights. At the time, his concerns had been shelved by a middle manager named Lorne Vess under the classification pending review. That decision now looked less like a clerical delay and more like a calculated deferral. Lorne was summoned for questioning and found himself cornered by dates, documents, and his own digital signature authorizing the downgrading of 3 past complaints about Merrick Dalen. Each complaint had been marked resolved by customer satisfaction gesture, a euphemism for handing out vouchers and hoping the victim walked away. This time, no amount of complimentary flight miles could erase the image of a flight attendant's foot aimed at a baby's face. Meanwhile, Darian remained composed, yet fully engaged. He didn't make media statements. He didn't seek vengeance. His focus remained on Leo, who had undergone a pediatric examination the morning after landing. The doctor had confirmed that the baby suffered only mild redness on the cheek, a small mercy granted by Darian's fast reflexes. But the examination also noted that the kick had landed alarmingly close to the orbital ridge. An inch in the wrong direction, the physician had muttered grimly, and we would have had a fracture. Darian documented every detail, cataloged every message, and archived every witness statement in a secure folder labeled Leo Primary. He had no intention of letting the incident dissolve into bureaucracy, but his next decision surprised even the board. When Aranex requested his guidance on drafting new reform proposals for oversight protocols, Darian agreed. Not out of pride, not even out of anger, but because he believed, in some distant corner of his guarded optimism, that systems could still be repaired if they were rebuilt on truth meetings began behind closed doors. Darian helped shape clauses that redefined what constituted a high-risk crew behavior pattern. He proposed a new flagging mechanism that bypassed managerial filters, sending future misconduct alerts directly to an independent oversight branch. The proposal was rigorous, unflinching. It didn't punish mistakes, it targeted cover-ups. Outside those rooms, the witnesses who had stood beside Darian received something unprecedented: thank you calls. One by one, passengers were contacted by Aranex's internal integrity liaison, not to silence them, but to acknowledge them, to verify facts, to thank them for their courage. In a culture where silence had once been rewarded, it was the first sign of something shifting. Raylan's message arrived late one night, quietly. "Never seen someone protect so much while staying that calm," the text read. "Your voice never shook, mine would have." Darian didn't respond right away. He stared at the screen for a long moment, watching Leo sleep beside him on the bed, a small hand curled into his shirt. He thought of the thousands of crew members who flew every day with honor, and the few like Merrick who hid behind that trust until it was too late. He thought of systems, both mechanical and human, that failed not because they were fragile but because no one had checked the bolts beneath them in years. And he thought of the 7 words he'd spoken without rage, without volume, just conviction. "You just lost your pension." He hadn't meant them as a threat. He had meant them as prophecy. Because when truth walks quietly through a sealed cabin, it doesn't knock, it floods in. And with each passing day, the impact of those 7 quiet words widened into a tide no one could ignore. The room was quiet. No fan buzzed, no phones vibrated, just the distant hum of a ventilation system and the rustle of suit fabric as men leaned in, trying to predict the moment that would come next. On one end of the long, brushed steel conference table sat Merrick Dalen. Spine rigid, jaw tight, his uniform blazer hung neatly behind his chair like a soldier stripped of his weapon. He stared forward, eyes red from nights without sleep, hands clasped as though in silent prayer. 2 seats down, Lorne Vess sat with the false calm of a man clinging to position by paper-thin threads. His collar was stiff, but his palms were moist, hidden under the table where no camera could catch the tremble. Across from them, seated upright, wearing no expression at all, was Darian Cross. His son, Leo, now nearly a year old, squirmed gently in his lap, a cheerful tuft of curls bouncing with each tiny motion. The contrast between father and child was striking. Darian's stillness anchored the room, while Leo's innocent energy made the silence almost bearable. At the head of the table, Chairman Dellen Hark cleared his throat. The gesture wasn't dramatic, but it echoed like a gavel. "We've reached a final determination," Hark said, voice calm but sharpened by resolve. His eyes flicked from one end of the table to the other. "After reviewing video submissions, passenger statements, internal service logs, and audit records, including alterations made mid-flight, we are proceeding with immediate action under the Harm to Minors clause outlined in our revised policy framework." He looked directly at Merrick. "Your employment is hereby terminated. Your pension privileges are revoked, effective immediately." Merrick didn't move at first. Then his head jerked slightly, as if he hadn't fully heard the second sentence. His lips parted, but no words came. He blinked, swallowing against a dry throat. "But protocol, there's arbitration," he managed, but no one interrupted. No one needed to. The silence spoke louder than his plea. Chairman Hark turned to Lorne. "Supervisor Vess, your record indicates 3 prior complaints related to employee conduct were improperly filed, with at least 1 marked for deletion. We are opening an inquiry into your handling of those cases. In the meantime, you are dismissed from your position, pending further review." Lorne's jaw flexed. He sat perfectly still, staring forward like a man calculating the weight of every misstep. No objection came. The camera in the far corner whirred softly, logging every blink, every breath, every consequence. Then Hark turned to a young man sitting farther down the table, Jaron Holt. "As for you, your decision to preserve the original log was noted in our ethics review. While we recognize the pressure you were under, your actions helped clarify the truth. You are reassigned to a compliance-supervised flight operations team, and this commendation will appear in your personnel record." Jaron nodded once, the relief in his shoulders evident. His voice, barely above a whisper, followed. "Thank you, sir." Darian did not speak. He didn't smile. He didn't react at all, except to adjust Leo in his arms, brushing a palm across the boy's back with practiced calm. Leo giggled softly, unaware of the tension, tugging at the edge of his father's coat. "And finally," Chairman Hark said, placing a final sheet of paper in front of him, "the Aerovance Review Board has approved the implementation of a new safety reform initiative, developed in collaboration with our ethics consultancy team." He paused. "It will be known as the Leo Protocol." All eyes shifted to Darian. This protocol includes mandatory third-party review of all cabin incidents involving minors, immediate preservation of in-flight logs, and restricted access to alter any incident record without supervisory verification. It also introduces direct reporting pathways for witnesses, with legal shielding to protect whistleblowers. The words landed like steel in velvet quiet. Precise. Permanent. Darian's voice finally entered the space, soft but firm. "No father should ever have to choose between silence and safety," he said. A few board members nodded. None spoke. Outside the building, reporters waited. Inside, no flashbulbs went off, no dramatic music played. Just decisions, just accountability. When the meeting ended, Darian rose from his chair with Leo in his arms. The baby cooed and waved at no one in particular. Jaron gave a quiet nod as they passed. Merrick didn't look up. Lorne sat motionless. As Darian stepped into the hallway, the hush followed him. He passed glass panels reflecting his silhouette. Just a man and a child. No entourage, no press briefing, no vengeance to deliver. Just an ending, and the beginning of a better structure behind him. Outside, camera crews angled lenses toward the exit. Some had waited all day, but when the elevator doors opened, there was no speech, no gesture, no raised fist. Just Darian, holding his son, walking toward the doors. On the ride down, the city grew larger below them. Leo leaned his head against Darian's chest. The soft ding of the elevator signaled the lobby. Darian looked down at his son and whispered gently, as the mirrored walls held their reflection in silence. That strength was not loud. Revenge was not rage, and justice did not always roar. Sometimes it walked slowly, carrying a child wrapped in calm. And as the elevator doors closed behind them, the world finally understood the full meaning of those quiet words spoken high above the clouds. He struck the child and froze as the father calmly placed the baby down and whispered, "You just lost your pension." If you believe real authority acts decisively without theatrics, subscribe now, because justice always knows how to land its blow. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, prejudice, and the moment accountability overtakes cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and treating every family with dignity and respect.